So we're going to be chatting about the future of people work, which in my mind is pretty similar to the future of work. Thanks so much to Responsive for having me, and in particular to Robin, who I don't think is in the room. A little bit about me. So this is a photo of me in my natural habitat. That's actually me. I'm in the wilderness, reading a book away from all other humans. I'm pretty introverted, so you can imagine that this setting is, not my comfort zone, let's say. But I'm here and I'm really excited about it, so thank you all for coming to listen. So I lead up org design and culture at Medium, which for those of you who don't know, Medium is a lovely blogging platform that connects people who have amazing ideas with people who want to engage and learn about them. And a little bit about my background, because I think like many of you, it's pretty non-traditional. So about 2 years ago, I moved to San Francisco with no connections, knowing 0 people here, and decided to start working on company culture. I'd had pretty insidious experiences working in finance and consulting, and so wanted to be a part of that solution. And I started working with startups in the Bay Area, doing consulting on how to scale their culture from 30 to 80 people. So right around the size where you stop knowing everyone at your company. And before that, I studied math and did management consulting. So really things that are entirely separate from people or org design work. And I think that's true for a lot of people who are interested in this field right now. You can see my Medium here, so at Jen Dennard. I don't really use Twitter. You can find me on there, but I'm not going to respond. I will respond to you if you write me on Medium or respond to any posts that I have there. So that's a little bit about me. I'd love to learn a little bit about you all. Who here works in either people operations or HR within a company? All right, lovely. And who works on org design or people ops externally? So you're a consultant or you do that type of stuff. Great. What about other roles, leaders or other positions within a company? Awesome. Welcome. I'm excited to have you all here. I think in particular the HR and people ops folks will really appreciate some of this content. So one thing that I've observed, and I'm curious to hear y'all's experiences with, is I think we're having a bit of an identity crisis within the people ops and HR world. So how many people here have heard or have worked with an organization where the people-related team was called human resources? Okay, what about people operations? Yeah, what about other things? I've heard culture vibe, all sorts of weird names. And you can see here people with ostensibly all the same role having extremely different titles. So you have Laszlo Block, who's now the former head of people ops from Google. You can see Mark Levy, the head of employee experience at Airbnb. Kathleen Hogan, the head of human resources at Microsoft. And Michael D'Angelo, the head of people at Pinterest. So every one of them has a different title, and they all do pretty much the same job. That's kind of weird. So most companies, if you're a sales human, you're a sales human everywhere. It's not something different. And so I think we're getting to this point in human resources and people operations work where everything is changing so drastically that we don't even know what to call ourselves anymore. And so we're trying to distance ourselves from what we've been in the past. And it's a really actually exciting time. This is, I get really jazzed about this type of work. I love my job at Medium. I'm just coming off our company retreat, so I've really been drinking the Medium Kool-Aid, so I apologize if I'm too enthusiastic, but I think everyone who's in this field is really excited about it. And I think what we've started to hear at a lot of companies is this idea that culture matters. I think in the last 6 months I've spoken on maybe 5 different panels on how to get your company culture right. And it's this move from what human resources has been traditionally to this idea that who you work with and the environment that you work in matters. And it's starting to be talked about in this way of culture. And I think the real conclusion that we're coming to here is that people matter. That the people that we work with, that the humans that we surround ourselves with in that environment are super important. And that seems kind of nonsensical in some ways, right? Like we spend all our days with each other. It should make sense that the people that we work with matter, but in some ways it's just really entered into our consciousness. And that means that it's a really interesting time for people operations and human resources because we get to decide how we work in that field, how we think about supporting an organization where people are one of the most important aspects of the work. And so what we're going to be talking about today is the future of people work. And so what we've heard in the last talk, and what I'll be going over a little bit again, is the change from physical work to creative work, how we've increased complexity drastically. And what this means is that when we're trying to support employees, we have to go from supporting their basic needs to their higher level needs, in much the way of thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this is pretty exciting and pretty out there on the edge of what is being done in organizations. And so to give some context, we're going to give some examples of what I call experiments from Medium, because we in no way have it figured out. We're experimenting just like every other company out there. So the changing world of work. So the McChrystal group went through this in really wonderful detail around the changing complexity. The World Economic Forum says that there have actually been 4 industrial revolutions, and that we're currently in the 4th. I trust them. They seem to know what they're talking about. And so we're going to go through each of these and really what each of these change in work has meant for human resources as an organization. Because that, unfortunately, human resources gets this kind of bad rap, and that we're kind of left behind in this org design future. And I think there's a really, really valid reason for why human resources as a group is often focusing on things that org designers or consultants are like, that's not important. There are really valid reasons for that, and it's important to understand how we create a group who is supporting all of our employees that actually can meet the needs of the different people. So in the 1780s, you had mechanized production. So this was the first kind of canonical industrial revolution that you hear about. And what it meant was that you could suddenly increase the productivity of one human drastically. So these are things like the power loom, the cotton gin, steam power. All of these things took the productivity of one person and increased them. So I think the power loom increased one person's productivity by 40 times. So what you could do with 40 people, now you could do with one person. So what you can also imagine is that then meant that labor was very replaceable, right? You didn't really care about each human because you could just replace them. We were also pretty down with using child labor at that time, so we had a really large workforce in general. And so human resources pretty much doesn't exist at this time. You have people who are thinking about, we need to supply people with space and with tools to do their work, and we need to pay them. But there's no sense of a human resources department at all. And this is so different from the creative work that we do today, right? Someone doing, creating, or taking the cotton fiber and removing that. That's very different work from what you and I do each day at our jobs. And so it's understandable that human resources is also pretty different. So the next thing that we get to is mass production. So in the 1870s, about 100 years later, this is when you get to something like Henry T. Ford, right? This is, again, you're getting to the complicated work that the McChrystal group was talking about, where you can plan it, and you know what you're doing, and you start to create assembly lines. And so this leads to essentially labor specialization. You're doing the same action over and over again to create your part of whatever widget you might be making. And so that means that labor actually becomes slightly more valuable because you have done this one action over and over again. So we don't really want to have to train someone else to do that. There's also, voting is getting started around this time, so workers' rights becomes a real topic. And so human resources starts to emerge really in response to the need for safety, and particularly actually in response to the need for women and children's safety. So that's where human resources is actually born. And what's interesting at this time is that this is really the origin of talking about company culture. You don't really think about it, but unions are where you really started to bond with your coworkers, and that really took on an important part of your identity in relation to your job. And this is also, unfortunately, where human resources starts to get the reputation that they're more on the side of the company than they are the employee. Because as you can imagine, when you have a manager who is dealing with overlooking all of the work, they're slightly more valuable to the company than the employee who's on the line. And so HR is required then to support the company and the more value that you see there rather than the average employee, hence why unions emerge to give them more power. So this is where that kind of bad rep that HR gets starts to emerge. And you can see exactly how different that is from today. Again, even though it's somewhat specialized, it's very physical in nature, the work that's being done, whereas today much of our work is actually more mental or more creative. So in the 1970s, then you get to what's called automated production. This is the third of our industrial revolutions, and this is something like when you can have robots creating a bread production line. And so you have white-collar work really start to emerge. And that means that we're using our brains more and instead of using physical labor. This is when we all start to gain a little weight as well. But what's really interesting is that how human resources starts to adapt. So performance management starts to emerge as something that HR is concerned about. And unfortunately, it's not out of a concern of how do we help employees grow. It emerges as how do we incentivize them to do the work that we want. Because as it turns out, just paying them or keeping them safe is not enough. We need to incentivize them in some way to get the training that we need to help them grow and advance. And part of that is that we want to retain employees, right? As we get more specialized and have more trained work, we need to keep our employees because it's costly to replace them. And as a result, we're willing to advance them, develop them in order to convince them to stay and to work for us rather than going to our competitors. There's an interesting backlash at this time where at some point our incentives switch and we're like, you train our employee and then we'll hire them away from you. So where we're starting to compete in particular for our employees. But this is where HR starts to think about the employee and their mental state. And so we're moving higher up in terms of their needs. We've gone from safety and physical tools that they need to how do we convince them that they're growing? How do we advance them over time? And we really value our employees at this point. And what's crazy is that HR is tasked with supporting employees at this level, as well as employees who are doing physical labor, right? So if you can imagine, I'm from an industrial town that does carpet factories. It's a weird place. But one of the things that's interesting is that the factories there, their HR team is supporting people who are on the factory floor, as well as the people who are doing their communications, who are doing more white-collar, so to speak, work. And that's really hard. If you think about that, the different needs that those individuals have, having one organization try to tackle that is part of where we see some of these tensions emerge, with HR being kind of protective or behind the times, as many people would say. So where are we now? So again, the World Economic Forum asserts that we're in this fourth industrial revolution. And really it starts to get to cyber-physical things that are going on. So we're not quite there with the Apple Watch, but almost. And things are just really changing pretty drastically. And we don't quite know what this state is or what it's going to be, but we do know that it's changing the nature of work. And so what that means is that creativity is really prized. So again, this is when complexity now is what we're thinking about. And creativity is how we solve those problems. So you can think of the best engineer is someone who's a really creative problem solver. And you have white-collar work actually being automated. So Gusto is doing this for benefits in the HR world. You see a lot of marketing being automated, a lot of basic engineering tasks, again, being automated, which is previously an individual's work. And so then what do we put the value on? We put the value on the creativity. The person creating that really awesome brand idea for your marketing campaign, the engineer solving that crazy problem, the people doing org design, let's hope, things like that. And so what that really means is that we are trying to now grapple in a world where the needs of our employees have changed drastically. And so what you can see is essentially you have a hierarchy of needs, similar to Maslow's, but for your employees. So HR has changed over time in terms of what it's able to serve, or what it's needed to serve. So you have the physical space. Do I have the building that I need to work in? Do I have the tools that I need to do my job? Do I have a computer? Those are the basic level for anyone to do any of their work. Next is it safe? So this is, again, getting to where workers' rights came out. Am I getting paid to do my job? Is there a reason I'm here? What are the benefits? These are how HR evolved over time. The next thing is people. And this is something that's interesting because people emerges before you get to advancement or development. And you can think about that in when you hear reasons why people stay at a company, it's often because of the people. And that's ahead of the actual work that they do. So people in the environment that you work in are really important. And HR is starting to take on this need as a part of their work. And then you get to development and advancement. So am I growing over time? Do I know what I'm doing? We just started doing leveling at Medium, and it works so well. I know how the whole system works, and it still incentivizes me as an employee to try to move up. So it's really meaningful in terms of people trying to succeed in their role. And then we get to this last part that is really taking on a level of importance now, which is on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is self-actualization, or the very top part. And in companies, this is the mission or the work problem that you're doing, and how does that tickle your brain? How does it get you excited in order to do this work? And in some extent, that has become managers and to some places, people ops role to try to convey that. What are our values? Why am I here? That's become much a bigger conversation, and you see this when people are talking about culture and who are we as a company, what's our mission? This is because we're trying to inspire people at this higher level of need because we're asking them to do creative, complex work rather than action X over and over again in terms of creating a widget. So I think this is super exciting. We really have just the beginnings of knowledge of what we're going to do in order to support this type of work. But it's really important to understand how HR got here and why, in some ways, it feels like they're still doing work from 10 years ago. It's because half the employees in your company are still doing work that was done in the way that it was done 10 years ago, right? The idea of a responsive org, in my mind, is really true and applicable for certain types of work, right? If you still have physical labor going on in your company, trying to self-actualize those individuals is unlikely to be successful, frankly. And that's not the support that they need. They need to know that they're safe, that they're well paid, and that they have the appropriate benefits to do their work, right? Whereas someone you're asking them to do a creative problem-solving exercise, they need to have huge amounts of psychological safety, creativity, to be inspired in order to really do that work well. So that, to me, is just a crazy thing to ask one org to solve all of those problems, and that's why you see HR or people ops often being overstrapped. And this is also an interesting time where HR is having to shift between protecting the company and protecting all employees because the value prop has changed. Now, a team of a few engineers are equally as valuable as an executive, right? There's not this huge power differential or value differential between leaders and employees because we're all relatively similar. And so that means that as an organization, a people ops team has to learn how to support all people in the same way or in similar ways rather than differentiating or choosing a few. And that's also just morally a great idea, but there's also valuable reasons to do that. So I wanted to share a few of the things that we do at Medium. And I want to preface that with a few comments. One is that these are experiments. Like many of you, we are trying things and seeing what happens. Some of these we've been trying since we started a few years ago. Some of them are newer, and I'll try to couch those as we go through. And I also like to mention that we are a well-funded company with an experienced founder who is willing to experiment and try things that some leadership teams aren't. And so we're lucky to get to operate in that way. And we've chosen to invest in org design and in people operations from the very beginning. And that's something that was a conscious choice by our founding team that I benefit from. I have a job and all of those things. So we'll go through some of these. And at the end, I would love to hear some examples from you all. So if you want to think about how you support creative or complex work at your company, I'd be super excited to hear that when we get to the Q&A section, because there's no way I can speak for an hour. So one thing that we think a lot about is supporting the whole person. So going back to this hierarchy of needs, right? When you're supporting someone by giving them a mission or a work topic that intrigues them, you don't suddenly get to not think about their physical safety, right? It's not like you're like, oh, just go out into this war zone. Like, you still have to support all of those things. You have to support their emotional side, their physical side, how they interact with others. And that's really difficult, but it's something that really prefaces a lot of these other examples that we're going to go through. And so when we think about any actions that we're taking or changes that we make, we think about how that impacts people's personal lives, their emotional state, their sense of psychological safety. And that's a really key part of how we approach people operations and org design. So one of the things that Medium has done since the very beginning is focus on mindfulness and awareness. And so that sounds essentially high level, but it means things like we have meditation 3 days a week, twice a day, and that's really valued in our culture. There was once a meeting that was scheduled over both sessions of meditation at Medium one day, and it was scheduled with our CEO, Ev, and he came in and he said, we need to give people the opportunity to meditate. Don't ever schedule a meeting over both of these times. And halfway through the meeting, he got up and left and went to meditate. So it's something that we really live and try to role model, as well as providing that opportunity. And it's also something that enters into our kind of language. in using things like, being aware of how others are. When we did a feedback training earlier this year on how to give and receive feedback, a lot of it was on being aware of your own emotional state and being aware of the emotional state of others. And so we incorporate that into how we do all the different aspects of our work, because we think that it's really important in terms of supporting the whole person again. That mindfulness is, interestingly, a very old technology, you could say, but is the best that we have in terms of supporting individuals' whole selves and their emotional state. Value-driven perks and benefits. So Medium, like many San Francisco and Silicon Valley companies, has wonderful perks. And you could look at that and say, okay, we do this for the competition for labor. But I think that we also do it out of our values. So we gut check everything that we offer with how does this fit in with supporting the whole person? Does this make them more aware? How does it enable them to better focus on their work and be content in their work and their life? So things like, again, meditation is a perk that we offer, and that's because we think it's really powerful in terms of helping people be creative in their day-to-day work. We also have things like education money that we give to each employee each year. And that's because growth and personal development is a huge part of their needs as a person, and therefore makes them a better employee because they're better able to be engaged and focus. So we have established processes. So this is an interesting one. A lot of, I'm sure of you are familiar with the idea of decision fatigue. So this most often has been talked about in terms of choosing what to wear. So Steve Jobs and Obama have both talked about how they chose the same thing every day to wear because it reduced the amount of decisions that they had to make. So a lot of our org design work actually focuses on reducing the decisions that people have to make. So something like we try to show how to run a meeting. This is actually a project that's ongoing right now where we are working on a software to help people run their meetings. And what that means is that each time they get into the meeting, people don't have to think about it. They just say, okay, click, here's what I have to do. And it also, nicely for us, provides us a way to tell them how to run that meeting in a pretty subtle way, right? Like we're not going into every meeting and be like, oh, did you do step 1, 2, and 3? We just give them a software, and if they choose to use it, then they're reminded each time. And it's our responsibility to make that software really great so that they will actually choose that. So that's one process. We also offer lunch each day. And that's because it, again, reduces the decision fatigue that people have to make. We don't make people wear the same thing every day, to be clear. It's not something that we advocate. But we do try to remove the decisions that people have to make each day, because what that means is then in their creative work, suddenly they have so much more cognitive ability. There's a lot of research, or a lot of great articles on this by 99U, if you've heard of that, which focuses on really creative work like writing, as well as entrepreneurship. And we take a lot of inspiration from that in some of our processes. Diversity and inclusion. So creative work is incredibly inhibited by a homogeneous workforce because you all come up with the same ideas and you all think that they're great. Whereas if you have a diverse group of people working on the problems, it is proven by research and proven by our experience that you come out with better solutions. And unfortunately, diversity is not enough. You can't just have people in the room. You have to find the ways to include them. And so we've really prioritized diversity and inclusion as a business imperative, as well as a moral good for our industry. And so you can see us doing that through things like we have partnerships with Code 2040. We get interns through them, and then we typically hire them. We also have partnerships or host events with groups like Women Who Code. We focus on highlighting our inclusion internally by doing demographic surveys and sharing who the people are that we have at Medium. Even if we don't have every group represented, we try to showcase the demographics that we do have. And there's a very vibrant dialogue around that internally and why it matters and how we can better support it through each other. People management versus work management. So this is a huge thing at Medium that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. So we separate the role of a people manager from the role of a work manager. So you have someone who leads your work, and that means they do things like setting goals for your team, they unblock the process, they help set the team culture, they help hold your team accountable for what needs to be done. And entirely separately, you have someone who supports you as a human, who says, hey, what coaching do you need? Let's have weekly one-on-ones. I am gonna have your back. I'm gonna advocate for you in terms of your compensation, in terms of your work assignments. And what we found is that by separating those two roles into different people, it helps us with a couple things. So first off, unfortunately, most people are not good at people management and work management. So it allows us to actually better allocate our workforce. It also is something that you usually don't have time to do both well. So when you're leading a team of 10 people, setting their goals and meeting the vision for the team and getting everything working is actually definitely a full-time job. So then to support each of those 10 people as a human is just like way extra. And you can imagine that the way that your brain works, you often make the trade-off of getting the work done because the downside is very tangible. The downside of not supporting your people as humans is harder to quantify in your head, and so you're much more likely to make that trade-off because we're risk-averse naturally, and therefore we don't want to have failure. So we're better able to invest in it by separating those roles into different people. Now, you can imagine that this creates problems as well. How do you get the appropriate context about someone's work when you're supporting them as a person? We have to have additional communication there. And so it really is a decision on our part to invest resources in that because it takes time, it takes people in order to support that. But what we found is that when you support someone as a human, meeting all of those needs, giving them psychological safety, the potential for growth, then they're so much better able to do the creative work that their work manager is like, great, this is awesome. And I will caveat this with, we can do this on our larger teams. It's really hard on a small team. So when you have like a 2 to 3 person team, separating those roles just gets really awkward. Like, oh, okay, I'm gonna talk to you now and you. It just doesn't work very well. And so we're still actually feeling that out in some of our smaller teams. But for instance, on our engineering team, we've been doing this for a while, and it's our largest team, and it's been pretty successful there. Authority. So earlier this year, we changed our organizational structure somewhat, and one of our guiding principles was that authority is distributed, but not equally or statically. So what does that mean? So empowered organizations or distributed orgs, you hear this idea of the self-empowered individual who gets to set all their work goals and do everything. And I think in the talk before this, you heard a little bit about how you scale that, how you do it in different ways. And so we think about that authority can be distributed to different individuals, but not on every topic. I have authority on certain things and very little in other areas. For instance, I can choose to launch our culture survey, our pulse survey where we check in on how our company's doing. I pretty much have full autonomy on deciding when that happens. I give an FYI to others, and if I hear any incredible pushback, then I may wait, but it's my decision. Whereas on something like deciding that we're going to separate the role of a people manager from a work manager, not my decision. And so you can see it's very uneven. And that also changes over time. So we try to make it very clear that individuals are always empowered, and with that they're leading a team, it's not necessarily a promotion. It's that they're the best person equipped at that time, and they're leading one team, but not another. Or they may lead one for a little bit, and then someone else may be the leader. And so that's a big thing that I think we also still struggle with. Leadership and authority is something that most people's mental models associate with respect and status. And so it can be hard to change that over time. And in particular, if you have someone in a leadership position, they feel like they've been promoted. And if you remove that, they feel like they've been demoted. So we're still struggling with that, to be frank. But I think that it's something that is, when you want to have a distributed org that's really self-empowered, it's something that you have to grapple with. And it's the new type of kind of leadership and what that means within companies. So the last thing is choosing our investment of resources. So all of this is premised on the fact that we choose to invest in this type of work. And our head of engineering yesterday was saying that it can feel like a luxury, but actually it's table stakes. In order to do the creative, complex work that we need to do, you have to invest in supporting the whole person. You cannot. You're just going to get less good work. And you won't realize it for a year or 2 years or 5 years. But when you do, you're going to be like, oh, the company culture really mattered, and I didn't think about that. Or people were deciding how to run every meeting that they had to do, and they wasted 5 minutes every time. And that really adds up when you have 100, 150,000 person org. Those are full-time employees that you're essentially wasting because you didn't invest in your org design or your people processes. So we make that conscious investment in order to support all of these other decisions that we have. So I really think that the future of work is just the future of people work, because companies are really just people. right? Google seems like this giant entity, but it's all people. It started with a few people, and now it's gotten to be a few more. Alphabet, I don't know what that is, but Medium is still just a group of people. In order to do the actual work, we have to support the people doing that work, right? That's the key part of actually getting to the future of work, is making sure that people are able to do it. Until AI takes over and they can do it all, but we're not quite there yet. So I would love to ask you all the question of how do you support creative or complex work at your company? And feel free to also ask me questions. Thanks. Yes. Yeah. Do we need a mic?
So thank you. My name is Tommy Lorsch. I own a social media agency with 250 employees across 50 countries. We just went self-managed for the this year. So I would like to address the elephant in the room here. The question is, which KPIs did you use to make the decision of transitioning out of production? Or what's the new model now?
So let me repeat, and you can nod or shake if that's correct, which is, what are the KPIs that you use for moving beyond holacracy, and what is the new system? So I wish we were organized enough to have KPIs on how we move beyond holacracy. I think when we were deciding the things that factored into our decision to move beyond holacracy, which for those of you who don't know, holacracy is a way of organizing using some of the Teal organization principles. So things like distributed authority, individual empowerment, and it's just one option in a way to do that. And it's a wonderful organization that we learned a lot from being that. I think what factored a lot into our decision to move beyond was that we actually found it to end up hampering some of our decisions to change. So under holacracy, you can technically do anything. You could have a dictatorship. You could have anything that you want. But you have to go within the holacratic structure. And so we found that to be cognitively quite heavy. The whole structure and language around holacracy was very hard for new employees to learn. It's a huge cognitive burden to ask someone to go from a completely traditional org to holacracy, where there's a whole language and system, and that's a lot for people to try to grapple with, in addition to understanding their brand new job. I think the KPIs for us were more that we were pretty sure around our decision that it was important to move away. And I think what we're struggling with now is, how do we map some of the stuff that we really loved about holacracy into this new system? So for instance, we really, really value individual empowerment. We think that's how you do creative work. That's the best way to do this type of work. And we struggle with some of the things that we haven't quite mapped from holacracy. So for instance, governance, which for those of you who aren't familiar, under holacracy, governance is how you make changes to the structure itself. And we are still deciding what that structure will be. And governance in itself really primes people to be empowered, because it enables every individual to think about what their role in the organization is, and it gives them an opportunity to have a yes/no say in it. And so we are still figuring out what that system looks like. I think what we have really adopted is the team of teams idea of having, instead of circles, we have something we call initiatives, where people are working perhaps on longer-lived teams or on shorter-lived teams. So we had an initiative related to our New York move, which we were moving offices, and so we had a team dedicated to that for a couple months. And then we have longer-lived teams, like people operations, that is unlikely to disappear after a few months. So we've been trying to adopt that more, but in general moving towards more long-lived teams than we had under holacracy, which in some ways was so flexible that we didn't give people time to adjust to their different teams. So we don't have a full answer for you, hopefully some tantalizing information. Yes?
Hi. My name is Shannon from Toronto.
Oh, we have a mic.
I just want this very recording, thanks. One of the things we spoke about yesterday was the rise of contingent workers or gig workers. Somewhere around 30 to 40% of the standard enterprise going forward is going to be contingent workers. Talk to me about how your model works when the definition of employee is changing so quickly and 30 or 40% of the workforce is no longer, quote, an employee. Mm-hmm. Did they get the perks?
So we have a much smaller experience of that. I think that my initial reaction to that is that they're still a human and that they still have similar needs. And so it's assessing where in that like industrial revolution or complexity trend they sit, and so what their appropriate needs are. I think right now we typically divide full-time employees or who we invest our perks and benefits in, but we try to make up for that in different ways. And part of that is in terms of thinking about how we value different individuals, what their role is, and how they interact with different people in the company as well. But I think in general, in terms of the lens through which we think about that, if we ever got to a place where a large swath of our workforce were contingent or that type of worker, we would analyze it in the way of what are their needs as a worker, how are those similar to our other employees, and how are those different? And I think we do that to some extent now, but in a much more ad hoc way, because it's a few people, so it's a different sort of process. Way in the back.
One sign I've noticed as you begin to empower people in the organization is that they may begin to have their own visions of stuff to do and stuff that may be incompatible with what the organization has set out to do. Where is the vision coming from in Medium now? Is that still Ev and the board, or who's kind of the keeper of what we are doing and what we are not doing and what we're not about?
Sure. I think in terms of the high-level vision, that still comes from Ev and our executive team, which we call our operating committee. And what that means, though, is that they are setting the mission or the overall strategy, and by no means directing how that's done, or even directing sometimes the specific strategy. So what we try to talk about is setting the problem out. So leaders are in charge of saying, here's the problem that we're trying to solve, and it's individuals' responsibility to figure out how, because they're much better equipped usually than leaders are to understand the system in which they're working and to come up with those solutions. And it's always an iterative process in the sense of being shared a problem, suggesting a solution, and then having give and take on what that solution ends up looking like. But what we aspire to and work towards is setting the problem rather than here's exactly what you should do. And so I think that problem setting definitely comes from our exec and leadership team and tiers down in different ways. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for the great talk. It really jumped out at me that moment where you were saying that you separate the people who sort of do work management and the people who do people management, right? And the sense that not everybody is good at both of those, or that when you're tasked with both of those, a lot of the time the work management gets, the front of the show and everything else kind of falls to the wayside. My question was, that makes immediate sense to me. How do you handle that when it comes to the people? You have certain team members who are really focused on the people, but then I imagine there are team members who are focused on those people, right? It's sort of like engaging with them and making sure that their work is going well. So at that level, is it then separated? Do you have people whose work is managing the work of those people and people whose work is the manage of working? It gets very confusing. I was just curious if there's a structure like that in place and how that plays out.
Yes, turtles all the way down. Yes and no. So I think on our larger teams is where we've started to really think about this. And in some ways, it's a team of people managers. So our people manager, that role is called a group lead. And so in our engineering team, we have each week a meeting between all the group leads. Or I actually believe now it's in sections because we have so many of them. And they are supporting each other. And then we have the person who leads up all engineering is also a part of that. And he is actually their people manager. So he is technically, I guess, managing that work as well, but he's really giving them the people support, and they're supporting one another on how to think through that stuff. On some of our teams where we don't have as much scale, the person who leads up that org, so our head of operations or our head of communications, they're doing both those things. And we really think of it as they can delegate the people management to the group lead. And so, for instance, our communications team is 2 people. So that person is head of that as well as doing the people management there. In a slightly larger team, you would see them supporting all of the people managers, and they're technically supporting that work, but that work looks a lot like people work. So they're more supporting them as individuals and creating the safe environment for them to do that work well. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Amelia. I'm people operations at a company called Verdigris Technologies, and this point specifically is very relevant to us because we've done the same thing, have split out what we have in terms of work management and then people management roles. And I just thought I'd share some of our ways of doing, and we'll continue to hopefully after. But
Please do.
what we did, we've called them coach roles, and because we are only 20 people, the scale element that you talk about, it is really hard to pull out. So we make it non-specific to teams. So we actually elect those coach roles across the organisation. We have 5 coaches that are accessible to anybody at any time, and therefore responding to the question of, as a coach, you have 4 peers who can play that role for you, and there's no sort of hierarchy within it.
Gotcha.
So no question, just more a sharing.
Awesome. Sure. You're going to stay on this side? There's a... Marks.
Thank you. Jennifer, you rock, and for you to say that up there is out of your element, I would have never known. So my question is, I'm helping out at a creative agency. So we have a team of graphic designers and different creatives with different mediums. And the conversation was, what happens when I lose my creativity mid-project? And so we're talking about efficient ways to reestablish that creative mindset through meditation or mindfulness or some sort of like dropping of all the thoughts and just clearing it. Do you have any exercises or activities that you've seen or done yourself?
Yeah, I think this most hits home for like me personally in the work. You can imagine as in a org the size of Medium, we have a pretty scrappy people operations team. So I switch between doing like day-to-day survey work and doing org design, creative work. What I found when my creative work is, there's no fountain there of creativity, doing something that is entirely different helps me a lot. And sometimes that means getting outside of the office, going for a walk. I found that physical movement really, really helps to move that like stagnant energy through, which sounds a little bit fluffy, but I have found it to really work. Doing another project for a week, I think there's usually a reason that your creativity is stymied for a moment, and that's often because you're looking at it through one spectrum and you need to get some perspective on it, and you're kind of beating down on this one idea, and then you need to be able to take a step back, and your brain needs a break from that essentially. And your brain is doing a lot of processing, so it's not that you're not working on it, it's that you're giving yourself time to process, and even in some cases just going and reading a book, something that is entirely separate from what you're trying to think about, is the best way that I've found to reestablish creativity. And I think always having a meditation or mindfulness practice is really key to that, because you can help essentially sense when you're getting to that point before you're at the point of like burnout or complete loss. You're like, oh, okay, I need to take a step back, and that helps prevent the full stop to the project, and more like, okay, I just need to go for a walk daily now, and that's going to help me like ramp back up. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Is this on? Okay. I relate to these evolutions in people ops from sort of a social change perspective and what it means for our culture at large. So I really appreciated your historical overview. And what stood out to me, though, was that there's sort of this built-in assumption that our economy is disappearing physical labor altogether, and that these new models, these evolutionary models in how we manage people, apply only to workplaces that are highly creative or cerebral. So I'm just curious from your perspective how you see these models maybe translating out into workplaces that still require physical labor and in which there's still quite a bit of labor exploitation, right? So thinking of like car wash workers or hotel workers, construction workers, like how, in a way that the historical outline sort of renders useless unions, and I think unions are still playing a role in that sector of our economy, which still exists, right?
Yeah.
So I'm super interested in how we build those bridges out and how they might apply in different work contexts. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Totally. I think that's a really wonderful question. What I think about it in terms of unions and their power there is it it causes companies to care about that stuff. So when someone is doing physical labor, you don't necessarily have to care about whether they're able to be creative, whether you have a diverse workforce. And the reason for that is you don't necessarily need it. And so what makes you care about that is the power of the employees. And so you can heighten that through collective action, which is unions. And I don't mean by any means to suggest that we're moving away from that. I think that is where I have so much empathy for HR teams, is that we're trying to somehow support all of that work, and that has very, very different demands. And so I think my biggest takeaway is resource your people ops teams more, that understand that when you are asking them to support physical labor, to create a safe working environment, you still, in California, right, you have to post every worker's information leaflet at your company. When you're asking them to think about that stuff, and then to think about supporting creative work and coming up with ways to make a psychologically safe work environment, understand that then you're asking that team to go through that whole simple, complicated, complex, chaotic thing all in one day, and that's hard. So my biggest takeaway is that HR needs to change, and that we're all a part of that, and that's super exciting. And that we can help to empower these workers in these different contexts by being a voice for employees rather than just a voice for the company, per se. Feel free.
I'm not sure that I buy into the sort of manual labor, creative work dichotomy.
Okay.
There's a lot of past examples. You want to go extreme and use the Favi example in reinventing orgs, but you don't have to go as far. You just can look at Toyota production systems in the 1970s. And to connect it to what Aaron said yesterday, I think that's sort of how do you up-level that? You give people that do manual work control not just over the work that they do, but actually how they go about doing the work. And that's a problem and a common denominator, whether you're doing creative work or you're doing physical labor. And in my mind, that's the connecting tissue, and that should be sort of what HR should be pushing for in both environments.
I'm not sure I agree. I think in some cases that's true. I think, again, when you think about employees as their whole selves, sometimes having established process is the best thing in the world. And I find that in a lot of my work, that I would prefer to be told what to do at times, and that I don't want to have to make every decision myself. And that's not to take that right away from others, but rather that I think to reference what the McChrystal group was saying, deciding the levels of decisions that you give people. And I think to your point, in some cases, or in many cases, we could give people a lot more and they would be happy, but to give them control entirely might be too much and overload them such that they then don't know what to do and then feel unproductive and don't enjoy their work at all. Yeah. Third time.
Thanks for your talk. I'm curious, because of your focus on inclusion and on mission, if you see any difference in different groups of people's ability to sort of go for their, to seek out the mission. And I'm thinking older people who have families to provide for, marginalized people who might have to provide more for their families. Do you see that there is differences in different groups that you guys need to incentivize or work with differently in order to retain?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. One of the things we think a lot about is how to create the right work environment for different types of people. And I think that plays into some of your question around, for instance, having flexible hours, that people don't need to stay until 11 p.m. if they have a family in order to be a part of strategy or creative work or setting the mission, that can happen hopefully during work hours. In terms of marginalized groups or things that are having to care for their family, we try to create benefits, and this is where it gets to value-driven perks and benefits that allow them to focus on their work and compensating them in a way that they're able to come to work focused. And what we try to do then is to accommodate different needs. And I think that we don't always have specific policies in place, like this group gets X, because A, that looks really bad from the outside and isn't always what's needed. But if we hear about a certain individual or a certain set of individuals that is struggling with a particular thing, then we try to adapt to that need. And then essentially it's us being responsive to those different situations and being aware ourselves of the different contexts that each employee is coming from. I think we have time for maybe one more. Okay.
Thank you. So you talked a little bit about the software, and I'm interested, like many other people are, around this difference between people and work managers. I think there's a lot of value in putting people in environments where their strengths can really shine and they don't have to do what they're weaker at. That produces a lot of efficiencies for them, for the system. But I think what can happen inadvertently when you put in crutches, you can allow people not to work on those weaknesses that they might need to work on. So I'm curious, I'm sure you've thought about this, but how does media mitigate that? I mean, a software that tells you how to run a meeting by giving you reminders is great, but it also doesn't actually produce real learning unless you have follow through, right?
Totally. We think a lot about that. So first, on the leader side, we think about there's a certain base set of responsibilities that everyone has, and one of those is creating a psychologically safe work environment. And that is, there's research by Google that shows that that's the most important thing to the success of a team, and that's not just the role of a people manager to do. Frankly, that's the role of every employee at Medium, and that is something that leaders in particular should be able to do, and it's their responsibility to ensure that it happens. And so it's not intended to be a crutch, though it can certainly become that. And I think that we have to focus on building individuals' awareness and their empathy, even if they are focused on work leadership. And that's something that we talk about a lot and in our trainings think about. So when we're even setting someone up to be a work manager, and this is actually brand new, we'll be training them still on what it means to do a psychologically safe work environment. And I think the software point is actually great. One of the things we have is essentially a way to signal through software that you're over-allocated. You're working 7 days a week instead of the 5. And I always joke when telling people about it, like, please don't use the software as a way to signal to us that you need help. Like, talk to us. The software is not the ideal. That's information for us that we get to use and analyze in different ways, but we are trying to both use the software to create structure and process, but by investing in the people side and the people management, support people in a way that hopefully gives us enough sensors throughout the org that if a meeting is going so poorly that they only know how to do it via the software, that we will hear about that in different ways, and hopefully not through a ping on our software. So there's different, I think, supporting and connected ways. If we only invested in software or process, it wouldn't work. You have to really think about the human as a whole, and we'll see if that works. Again, these are experiments. All right, I think that's all, but thank y'all, and feel free to come up after.